Salve, Legionaries. Okay, well, I'm back with the third installment of the planning cycle for MCDP 5 planning. This is going to be, again, a guided reading, so sit back, relax, let's discuss, and just jump right in because I don't want to waste any of y'all time. So first things first, the quote starts, of course, with Helmuth von Moltke, and the quote is, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." And the next one is by Patton, "Plans must be simple and flexible. Actually, they only form a datum plane from which you build as necessity directs or opportunity offers. They should be made by the people who are going to execute them." How refreshing, and how different it is as far as how the military plays out in reality. Everything is usually meat puppeted and micromanaged from the top levels. But anyway, this is Chapter 3, Planning Effectively. Again, like I said, MCDP 5. And we're going to be discussing about the actual ways in which we're able to engage in the planning cycle. And in those ways, how is it that we're going to make sure that it's effective? So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. Having arrived at a common understanding of the fundamental nature of planning, and having discussed the theory of planning, we now describe the characteristics of effective planning. In other words, how do we plan effectively? And what are the features of good plans? Planning in maneuver warfare. Proper planning is essential to the execution of maneuver warfare. Planning is an inherent and fundamental part of command and control, and commanders are the single most important factor in effective planning. Maneuver warfare demands a flexible approach that adapts planning methods to each situation, taking into account the activity being planned. It requires an approach that can apply the various aspects of planning theory as appropriate. This planning approach must encourage rather than stifle creativity. Maneuver warfare depends on insight and creativity in commanders and the planners who support them. Planners must always be sensitive to the importance of tactical and operational tempo and ensure that planning facilitates rather than inhibits tempo. In fact, effective planning should accelerate tempo by anticipating decisions and actions. This emphasis on tempo, while a guiding principle, is not an unbending rule. We should weigh the advantages of acting more quickly against the advantages of preparing more thoroughly. You see, the communists, they attacked my throat. Anyway, I keep on reading. Maneuver warfare requires plans with the proper level of detail. Neither so detailed that they squash initiative, nor so general that they provide insufficient direction. The proper level of detail depends on each situation and is no easy task to determine. As a rule, plans should contain only as much detail as required to provide subordinates the necessary guidance while allowing as much freedom of action as possible. Effective maneuver warfare planning is based on the recognition that war is intrinsically uncertain and unpredictable. Effective planning seeks not to determine uncertainty and risk, but to provide a framework that facilitates effective and focused action in the face of uncertainty and risk. Effective planning also recognizes the limits of foresight in a complex and changeable environment like war. Effective planning does not try to impose precise order and control on the battlefield, to try to turn war into something it's not. So that is to say, we're stepping away from the French model of World War I, where, they're going all the way to the top and meat puppeting dudes all the way at the bottom to the company level. We're not doing that, okay? Reading again. Instead, planning should provide enough structure to facilitate necessary cooperation and direction, but not so much structure that we sacrifice flexibility, tempo, or initiative. Recognizing the proper balance in any given situation requires judgment. The maneuver warfare approach to planning sees planning not only as a way of directing and coordinating actions, but also a generating shared situational awareness and expectations supporting the exercise of initiative and structuring the thinking of commanders and planners. Maneuver warfare emphasizes planning as a continuous learning and adapting process rather than as a scripted process. Maneuver warfare requires the ability to extemporize. That is, to be able to depart from the original plan to exploit fleeting opportunities. And planning, importantly, provides the point of departure for such adaptation and execution. So, as I said before, planning, and I recommend that you go back to my transmissions on MCDP5 and MCDP5 TAC 2, where we talk about the efficacy of planning. And the planning is to provide you with almost like a skeleton. I don't know if you remember a building being constructed, like a skyscraper. Remember when they're building that skyscraper, it's kind of like a skeleton at first, right? It's just steel beams, and then you add on to it, right? And then you start fleshing it out. Well, consider a good plan to be simply the skeleton of action, to provide you context and to provide shared awareness. So elements that are to your left and right, up and down, understand what you're doing, and to be able to react to the enemy in a meaningful way, which allows for your friends to act in coordination or in combination with you. Now, I think we'll get into this as we continue, but I'm going to go ahead and start reading again. The maneuver warfare approach to planning emphasizes the importance of established clear objectives, even as it recognizes the difficulty of doing so in a complex, uncertain, and shifting environment like war. Effective planning should generally proceed from the establishing of goals and objectives to the conceiving of broad courses of action to the detailing of the practical implementation of these courses of action. At the same time, the conceptual aspects of planning, to include establishing goals, should be responsive to the detailed requirements of execution. The maneuver warfare approach to planning is based on the belief that in typically complex and shifting tactical and operational situations, the best approach is usually a plan in rough outline and delegate as many decisions as possible to subordinates, empowering them to act on their own authority. In order to act appropriately, these subordinates require a thorough understanding of the overall purpose or goal, which can only be provided by higher authority. So, obviously, as you can probably understand, this is something that Jocko Willink himself talks about, and it's effectively delegating power, but assuming ownership, right? So, it's extreme ownership is basically empowering subordinates and retaining that unity of authority and command. Returning to the text. Situational factors. 3 types of factors drive each planning effort. First, there are external factors stemming from the environment. These include the time pressure placed on planners, the type and degree of uncertainty the planners must handle, and the instability and turbulence of the situation. Next, there are internal factors stemming from the availability and capabilities of planners themselves. These include the skills and degree of experience and expertise. Internal factors also include the tools and equipment available to support the planning process. Last, there are task-related factors having to do with the nature of activity being planned. Among other factors, these include the characteristics of the activity themselves, the complexity of the situation, the clarity and stability of the goals, and the availability of resources. Is the situation fluid or static? Is the plan a tactical plan or a technical one? Is the envisioned end state clear? Is it likely to change? There are numerous factors to consider, most of them interrelated and some in conflict with one another. Some factors are always more important than others, and some are more important in some situations but not in others. The following discussions are not exhaustive, but give an idea of how we should take various factors into account in our planning process and in our plans. Time pressure exerts a major influence on the type of plan we develop. It takes longer to develop detailed and integrated plans. As a result, where time is short, we might do better to develop broader modular plans. Similarly, it takes longer to develop optimized plans. When time is short, it is better to accept a less than optimal but workable plan. Uncertainty is another major factor that impacts on building and planning plans. Where uncertainty is high, plans should generally be broad, loosely coupled, and highly flexible. Such situations favor modular plans that are easily repaired. Conversely, where certainty is relatively high, or the reasonable expectation of friction or enemy interference is low, plans can be detailed and integrated. So, just a sidestep here, I was just thinking to myself, it's not simply what is best for you, so as you have more time to prepare, your plans are better detailed and integrated and coupled, right? So you're able to link up with associated units, lateral, up and down, side to side, so on and so forth. But think about it this from the opposite direction. This is why going through the OODA loop faster is always, in effect, better on the battlefield. And it's part of the reason why if you're on the offensive, if you're disrupting or putting time pressure on the plans of the enemy, you're allowing yourself to leverage that as a force multiplier. That's part of the reason why, you take the physics equation of force equals mass times acceleration. Well, consider time and the initiative as acceleration. And consider the fact that if you're able to disrupt the planning process and the planning cycle of the enemy, and keep always on the offensive, keep always them on their back heel, changing the environment, the cognitive environment for them, so that way they can't actually effectively plan in a long enough time horizon, it'll help you. Now back to the book. Let's see here. The scarcity of critical resources may drive us to develop detailed and integrated plans that tend to make more efficient use of resources. Integrated and complicated plans tend to require more expertise to develop, but less expertise to execute. They are more difficult to design because of the various elements that must be coordinated. Where different planning staffs are not co-located and coordinated is difficult. Loosely coupled plans may be preferable. If subordinate commanders are less experienced, we may be compelled to develop more detailed plans that provide more guidance while requiring less judgment and execution. Conversely, where subordinates are experienced, we can develop plans that provide subordinates the latitude to adapt to circumstances. So, obviously, this is part of the reason why the Soviet or Warsaw Pact pattern armies are so heavily dependent on very top-down, kind of an autocratic type of leadership, is because effectively the way that they have their military set up is so that way the enlisted corps is roughly one made predominantly of conscripts with limited training and limited experience, real-world experience. Now, in a professional pattern military, such as that of the U.S., and I think largely NATO as well, which, for instance, the French, the British, or at least they used to, they're able to actually have a very educated and well-professionalized corps of enlisted, especially non-commissioned officers, and so are able to execute the latitude of action necessary on the battlefield that is more wide than the very strict battle orders that you think a Soviet commander would give his conscript company or battalion, okay? So the delineation is knowing the capability and limitations of your unit. If you're a fresh green unit, likely it's the case that you will be needed to have your hand held or hold their hand so that way they don't mess it up or don't act above what their skill level is. Let's just say that, right? But if you're with a bunch of grizzled veterans who already have a developed SOP, unit cohesion, a certain esprit de corps, indomitable will, you don't really need to meat puppet them. meat puppeting only works for like low skill people, low motivated people. But if you have warriors who are already grizzled and tried and bloodied, you're able to just tell them, hey, take that hill, don't do left or right lateral limit that you specify, do it by a certain time with a certain end state, and figure out the rest. And under those considerations, they'll act. This is why I think I highly recommend reading the book About Face. It's a book about the life or roughly the career of Colonel Hackworth. The way that he extemporized plans and he planned with his team, especially when he was in Korea, is probably the best way you should have small unit tactics and small unit leadership, I guess, planned out, or just the vibe in general. I'd recommend you read that book. It's very long, but it's extremely fruitful, and it honestly should be a required reading on the Commandant's reading list, but because it's Army and because of the fact that he stood against the DoD and he was persecuted by the FBI and they sicked the agents on him and all that good stuff, it likely won't ever make the cut. To say nothing, of course, of the communist-held DoD at this current moment. But, you know, in a perfect America, that certainly would make its way onto every single military commander's and enlisted men's reading list, bar none. This guy is just all kinds of exceptional. But anyway, returning to the text. No two situations are the same, and different situations require different planning techniques and different types of plans. That said, however, the Marine Corps' warfighting doctrine is based on a view of war as a time-competitive, interactive clash characterized by high levels of friction, uncertainty, disorder, and unpredictability. Such conditions favor simple, modular, flexible, and timely plans. So, what does this mean? Effectively, the Marine Corps is an expeditionary force. It is elite, but it's more than simply elite. It's not used, generally speaking, for shock tactics. Usually what it is, or originally it had been planned to use the Marine Corps as a expeditionary unit that is able to go to foreign shores where the disposition of the enemy is roughly unknown and have them act in a certain and circumscribed way, okay? And what that means is effectively you're going into a position where you don't know the disposition of the enemy too well, that you have a certain very limited goal that you're trying to achieve, especially, for instance, in the Banana Wars, so on and so forth. You're not going crazy, right? You're not doing years-long campaigning in this place to take over a large piece of territory, consolidate it, and annex it, right? You're not doing what the Army does. You're doing something completely different. And so in that environment, especially because of the fact that you're probably dealing with a numerically superior enemy that is likely disjointed and not as well coordinated, you have to leverage maneuverability and time, so OODA loop, and use that. When I say mass times acceleration equals force, right? Well, if you're lacking in mass, you have to make sure that your operational tempo reflects in the acceleration factor of your equation, of your force equation. And therefore, that's why so much of the Marine Corps is geared towards maneuver warfare. It's geared towards exploiting weaknesses and maneuvering around or bypassing enemy strengths. But I digress, and so I continue on. Simple plans. Simplicity is one of the fundamental tenets of our planning philosophy. Plans should be as simple as each situation allows, because in war even the simplest plans are difficult to carry out. There is an important difference between simple and simplistic, the latter referring to something that is made overly simple by ignoring the natural complications of the situation. We realize that each plan must deal with the complexity of its situation, and that some situations require more complicated plans than others. However, this is not to say that a complex situation automatically requires an equally complicated plan. Some complex problems may have surprisingly simple solutions. We prefer simple solutions because they are easier to generate and comprehend. They are easier to implement, and more importantly, to implement well. The simpler a task, the more easily we can master it. Simple plans are generally easier to modify or repair, an essential quality given the friction and disorder of war. Finally, simple plans are also usually a better starting point from which to adapt to the unforeseen. That is, they're durable under changing circumstances, okay? Back to the text. There are several ways to simplify plans. First, we should keep the number of actions or tasks in the plan to the minimum required by the situation. This is largely a function of organization. Fewer actions simplify the problems of a command and control. Too many tasks can exceed the limits of an effective span of control. We can often reduce the number of actions by grouping related actions together, by placing this group of actions under the authority of a subordinate. We can also distribute the planning load throughout the organization rather than bearing it all in one place. These grouped actions must be logically related, or we unduly complicate the situation for the subordinate. Now, before we continue, I want you to remember that this is why it is so important to delegate your authority in planning actions. It's because this is why, for instance, in the Ukraine, in Russia, when a general or an officer gets whacked on the battlefield, like entire units start falling apart. They start not being able to be as command effective, and therefore it's part of the reason why the NATO-oriented or Ukrainian forces target them, is because ultimately it's a weakness of the command structure. If you're basically your core competence and planning and command, your entire C2 is located in one direction, that's point failure, right? Because as soon as that guy dies, inevitably, it's war, casualties are expected, and so are your officers expected to have higher casualties. In fact, officers have the highest rate of casualties. In the Yom Kippur War, for instance, the IDF experienced roughly 70% casualty rate among their officer corps, which was a standard deviation higher than the line. It's important that you understand why it is that you give your subordinates and your NCOs the ability to act, to get the reps in on planning, because ultimately it may be very well that you're dead, KIA, or you're wounded and you're incapacitated, but the fight still goes on. And if you're not doing that, you're going to get your guys killed. Anyway, continuing on. We can simplify by developing plans that are as broad as the situation permits. We simplify by minimizing the burden of detail. Where possible, leaving those details to subordinates and again distributing the planning load. For example, instead of designing the coordination of two subordinate units, we can direct the units to effect the necessary coordination locally. The key is to develop plans that are broad but not vague. Finally, even though a situation may be complex and may require numerous actions, we should try to develop a plan that is embodied in a simple, compelling concept that captures the essence of the situation. Sometimes the simplest plans are the most inspired. Conceptualization is no mean ability. It is a function of insight and vision. It is part of the creative element of planning and cannot be captured by following any set procedure. A compelling concept that includes the underlying intent conveys the logic of the plan in simple but powerful terms. This allows subordinates to act out of understanding and thus lessens the requirement for explicit instructions covering every eventuality. Loose and modular plans. Success in war requires coordinated effort, the cooperation of two or more elements for the accomplishment of a common task. Coordination occurs in time or space or both. Examples include two units performing a passage of lines, an envelopment conducted by two units, preparatory fires shifting of an objective as an assault element closes, or a close airstrike involving suppression of enemy air defenses. Providing for necessary coordination is one of the primary functions of planning and plans. Plans provide a mechanism for coupling those activities that must be coordinated and cannot be coordinated effectively another way. How tightly or loosely coupled the elements of a plan should be depends on a variety of factors discussed in the previous chapter. Some activities require tighter coupling than others. Some situations permit looser coupling than others. Some parts of a plan may be tightly coupled while other parts of the same plan are loosely coupled. For most tactical or operational situations, which tend to be characterized by friction, uncertainty, disorder, and enemy interference, we should strive to design relatively loose modular plans. Compared to tightly coupled, integrated plans, modular plans are generally simpler to execute and control, are easier to modify, better endure the effects of friction and disruption, and provide a greater latitude in execution. Loose coupling is also an important way of achieving simplicity. Loose coupling supports simplicity by lessening the need for design coordination measures. A modular plan allows each subordinate element to plan with some degree of independence of others, simplifying the overall planning effort. A plan can provide for necessary coordination in several ways. The simplest and loosest way is to direct two elements to coordinate locally. Another way is to provide the mechanism for coordination, such as a control measure, but to let the elements involved affect the coordination as necessary. A third way is to provide the coordination mechanism and to regulate its use. Of these, the first is the most flexible. The last is the most controlled. Situation permitting, the first is most preferable, and the last least preferable in providing subordinate units latitude to adapt to changing circumstances. So an example would be the radio, right? So providing the mechanism of two subordinate units who are adjacent to each other, what you could say is basically they would use hand and arm signals, voice commands to coordinate with each other, and you delegate that to them. Providing the mechanism, or rather the control measure, it's kind of like providing them with a radio net where they can coordinate with each other locally, but through the same mechanism, or rather through the same control measure. So you're basically on the loop. You're ready to interfere or interdict should there be bad coordination or bad choices being made. Then the last one, an example would be, for instance, if these two adjacent units needed to contact you to then finally contact the other adjacent unit to be able to effectively communicate back and forth. Now, you have the majority of the mechanism and the control measure in your hands. However, that is causing a huge latency and a game of telephone happening, literally, which will, of course, take initiative and time and give the enemy to operate the ability to OODA loop faster than you. And so unless you absolutely need this to be this way, it is likely that the more integrated your adjacent units are, the better, even if it means not having a check on their communications. Now, reading again. Plans should not attempt to couple actions which do not need to be coupled. As important as coordination can be, it occurs at a cost of flexibility and freedom of action. This point seems self-evident, but sometimes attempts are made to couple unrelated elements in a plan. This is usually done in an effort to achieve a degree of control of the situation which is rarely attainable nor even desirable. Instead, the goal should be to uncouple elements of the plan as much as possible, consistent with the need of the unity of effort. Any time we're about to establish some control measures to coordinate two or more parts of the plan, it's not a bad idea to ask ourselves, do these actions need to be coupled? As a general rule, plans with many control and coordination measures, especially restrictive measures, tend to be tightly coupled. This does not mean that to achieve loose coupling we simply eliminate control and coordination measures from plans. Such measures serve an essential purpose when properly used. Instead, this means that we conceive plans in such a way, when possible, that direct coordination between elements of the plan is not necessary for the success of the plan. This function of conceptual design is no simple task. It may be that some elements of the plan can support each other indirectly rather than directly, as the example of Allenby's campaign in 1918 showed. And this is an allusion to the previous chapter's campaign, British campaign in Palestine, 1918. Continuing. Establishing loose coupling is in part a function of task organization, to organize subordinate units into self-sufficient tactical units by assigning them the necessary support lenses lessens the need for the centralized coordination of support. This also simplifies command and control, although possibly at the expense of efficient use of resources. As a very simple example of planning loose coupling, consider coupling between a scheme of maneuver and a plan for supporting fires. A ground attack supported by scheduled fires is a tightly coupled system. The movement and fires are synchronized. Changing one necessitates changing the other. This example describes an extremely simple system of only two parts. Consider the complications in a tightly coupled tactical plan of average complexity. By comparison, a ground attack supported by on-call targets is a loosely coupled system. The two parts are asynchronous. Changing the time of one does not necessitate changing the other, although the fires can still be used to support the movement. This is not to imply that scheduled fires are bad, like other examples of time coupling. They are sometimes necessary, but merely to illustrate how we increase flexibility by developing loosely coupled modular plans. And so, to continue on, so that way you understand how this works, in World War I, the idea of a rolling barrage had been innovated. A rolling barrage is basically you set a barrage, pretty easy, and you start bracketing the enemy, right? Bracket by bracket, and you ratchet up over and comb over the positions of the enemy. So that way the indirect fires are causing either casualties or effectively keeping their heads down and suppressed, the enemy suppressed, and the infantry follows them closely, follows that artillery barrage. But back then, they didn't have resources, right? And they had, I guess they had field lines, but remember, field lines are easily cut. There's a limit to how long that wire can be. And so the best way to coordinate those fires and infantry advances is by tightly mirroring right behind the barrage on a timetable the bracket. This, of course, can lead to casualties. Friendly fire, as I'm sure you know, you have to be pretty close to the barrage for it to be effective. And what that means is, effectively, they were dependent on the artillerymen doing their job as the bracket allowed. But also, it meant that if you fell too far behind the artillery barrage, you may obviously not incur the benefits or the defense or the suppressive element of that fires on the enemy to make your objective happen. You're entirely dependent on the timetable. This is what's called tight coupling. Now, the best type of coupling, always in a battle sense, is loose coupling. Loose coupling allows for, effectively, if you've ever played a war game that's like Warno or World in Conflict, but you basically have units on a map, and at that time you need IDF or some kind of special strike on an enemy. You're able to call upon, on demand, that strike at a precise location at that time. Obviously, there's a latency. That latency causes you initiative, or it basically costs you initiative, but there is a benefit to that. That loose coupling also gives you that flexibility of maneuver. Maybe you're able to preempt, and so on. I know this sounds probably way out there, but this is part of the reason why planning is one of those most essential things, and it's why I decided to make this series of transmissions, because there is so little effort to talk about planning as such, and so much of it is relied upon the individual's acumen for natural planning or simply habituated planning without any big picture understanding of how these things work. If you zoom out, what is the process of planning and how to help? I think it's essential that warfighters are reading the publications, the doctrines, not because necessarily they should do them by the book, so to speak, but because it informs you and because it allows you, it gives you those tools. Like I said to you in the last transmission, it allows you to have a go-to framework for how to do things. And when you're in the crush of battle, first of all, it helps you catalyze the event, but second of all, it helps you do it faster than the enemy. And in the crush of battle, time is essential. And therefore, if you save time, you save initiative. You retain the initiative, you crush the enemy, and victory is assured. Do you understand, Legionaries? Okay, thank you so much. Adaptive, flexible plans. Planning is a way of adapting the organization to its surroundings in two ways: by designing actions in advance of the need to act, and by supporting the exercise of initiative during execution. Because of the unpredictability of war, a good plan should be flexible, allowing us to adapt quickly to a broad variety of circumstances. This obviates the need to develop explicit courses of action for an unlimited number of possible contingencies. The level of flexibility in a plan should be in direct proportion to the level of uncertainty and unfluidity in the situation. Initiative is central to maneuver warfare. We should plan with this thought firmly in mind. A good plan does not eliminate the need for initiative, but facilitates initiative itself. Patton's quotation at the beginning of this chapter captures this idea in describing a plan as a datum plan from which you build as necessity directs or opportunity offers. We should not think of a plan as an unalterable solution to a problem, but as an open architecture that allows us to pursue many possibilities. A good plan should maximize freedom of action for the future. It is a mistake to think that the goal is to develop plans and then implement them as designed. We will rarely, if ever, conduct an evolution exactly the way it was originally developed. This emphasis in adaptability and flexibility must be tempered by an intelligent understanding of where necessary couplings exist in the plan. We do not have complete freedom to depart from the scheme without consideration. We certainly do not have the freedom to depart from the larger intent of a plan. We must be sensitive to ways any departures may affect the other parts of the plan, and must therefore keep others informed of our actions. How do we design adaptive, flexible plans? First, we establish objectives that are broadly, but not vaguely defined, objectives which provide latitude in the manner of accomplishment. Second, as we have discussed, we develop loose modular plans. These allow subordinates to adapt without infringing on other parts of the plan. Third, we develop plans with feedback mechanisms designed to provide information about how the action is developing and to identify the need to make adjustments to the plan. We make explicitly design decision points in a plan of action requiring a decision about how to proceed in execution. Fourth, we should design plans of action that permit multiple options in execution. We may design specific branches and sequels, planned alternatives, or follow-up phases for likely contingencies, but we also maintain the flexibility to pursue other options that are not planned. We should not try to develop plans for every possible eventuality. We should not develop so many contingencies that we cannot prepare adequately for any of them. Fifth, we should develop plans which provide shared situational awareness and mutual expectations. A common understanding improves the ability to recognize the need to adapt and to cooperate with others while doing so. Finally, we develop orders and plans that provide the compelling logic for action that makes it easier for subordinates to exercise initiative while confronting or conforming to the higher purpose. The compelling logic for action finds expression in the commander's intent for each subordinate. End quote. So that's probably the most important quote. This last paragraph right here makes explicit roughly several different or 7 different maxims by which we should be making our plans and how to judge its efficacy. Let me just go down one by one, and I think it's important. First, establishing objectives that are broadly but not vaguely defined. Probably the best way of explaining this is making sure that you give a terrain feature, a temporal feature, and an end state feature. So a posture, right? So this means take that hill by this time and then establish dominance over this terrain. Set up security. You're setting 3 very specific end states to your objective mission. Does that make sense? So you're not just saying take that hill. Okay, so if I take that hill, what does that mean? Over how long? And so on and so forth. It has to have that kind of element. I'm not going to go through each point, but as the last thing that I want you to focus on is the fact that you have modular plans which allow you for a variety of action. This word, branches and sequels, is something that is a common recurrence in military thought. B.H. Littleheart, which I think I should do a whole episode about strategy, talks about how superior strategy is in effect always putting your enemy on branches, making them put themselves on a defensive situation where neither option is acceptable or good. Both of them are, it's basically choosing the lesser of 2 evils. It's effectively seizing the initiative and causing punishment. I think this is important. It's something that should come intuitively. It's not something that you can necessarily train into an individual, but it's something you should be able to look for and try to make that happen. And if you're able to balance 2 plans, likely this element, like I said, this element which puts the enemy on branches, which forces them to be put in a defensive situation that they're reacting, and in their reaction they're given only bad choices, should win out over one that is likely more quote-unquote effective, but provides an option for the enemy to not be decisively engaged, or to put them in a situation in which the enemy has a very good option of getting out of it. We'll explore this concept in the future, especially as I make these lectures as time goes on, but this is something you should be, as a commander, as a leader, as a warrior, really focusing on when you make those good plans. Making sure the enemy has a golden bridge of exfiltration or retreat, and then of course ambushing him on that retreat. Good to go? Alright. Timely plans. Timely plans are directives that are issued in a way that allows subordinates ample time to make preparations and issue their own orders. Few factors are more important to success than giving subordinates enough time to prepare. We frequently underestimate the time required for directives to permeate through various echelons of an organization. In many situations, a warning order may be useful to provide subordinates time to begin preparations for a contemplated action. Moreover, because planning is an iterative process, it is often advisable to issue partial instructions as they are available rather than wait to issue a complete directive. Subordinates can then begin their own planning. For reference, an iterative process is what he means by that. It is something that is constantly happening and rehappening. You know, it's something that's constantly being reassessed and redone, even all along the same. Think of it like a radar ping, if that makes sense. Constant planning is making that ping happen, and then it goes and swirls around, and then it comes again and pings again, right? Different location. That different location being a different plan. I don't know if that analogy makes sense to you, but the idea is that plans change over time because circumstances change, and therefore the way that plans should be is almost a shared cognitive horizon that you spread among your subordinates, your superiors, and your peers and adjacent forces, okay? It's basically making sure you're synchronizing the unit so that way they all have a shared conceptual horizon of the circumstances and situation that you're in. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but like I said, visualize that radar ping being constantly pinging out. So constantly, iteratively looking for those contacts, looking for the horizon, the terrain. Same thing with plans. Plans must be constantly be made in reaction to those radar pings, okay? Planning in time. Effective planning requires not only issuing timely plans, but also planning in time. Planning in time has two aspects. First, it requires making effective use of the time available for planning. Second, it means configuring efforts over time to create a meaningful sequence of actions that lead economically toward the envisaged goal. It is difficult to state without exception that any one consideration is always more important than any other, but in nearly all situations, time is the critical factor. Whether done deliberately or rapidly, all planning requires an acute awareness and judicious use of time. All planning is time sensitive. In general, planning should not occur at the expense of tempo. At the same time, if time is available and there is no advantage to acting more quickly, there can be little excuse for not taking the time to plan deliberately or adequately. A company commander who spends an hour deliberately developing a detailed plan in the heat of a crisis when seconds matter is as much at fault with respect to proper use of time as a division commander who has days to prepare for an amphibious landing and hastily develops an ill-conceived ship-to-shore plan. We must be constantly aware of how much time a situation allows for planning. Realizing this will usually be an estimate, and we must make the most of that available time. This means being aware of potential trade-offs between decision planning and execution planning. In allocating planning time, we cannot take only our own planning requirements to account, but we must also consider the planning requirements of subordinates. We must be aware of any advantages to be gained by using less than the full time available. We must weigh such advantages in tempo against the advantages of more thorough planning. At the same time, we should recognize the moment when taking the time to consider our actions beforehand may allow us to act more quickly later. We must recognize that situations are dynamic rather than static. The situation continues to change while we plan for it, and the longer we take to plan, the more the situation will have changed. Finally, we should know when it is time to stop planning and to begin executing. We should recognize that there may be times when planning or additional planning is not justified. It's a common tendency to project plans too far into an uncertain future. The quotation from Moltke at the beginning of the chapter that no plan survives contact with the enemy is well known. Many plans do not last even that long, because we cannot anticipate the unforeseeable. We tend to assume the future will be a linear projection of the present and recent past, and we frequently underestimate the magnitude of changes in the pattern of events over time. Consequently, our assumptions about the future, especially the distant future, are often greatly in error. Therefore, effective planning and planners do not try to plan too far into the future. They maintain nearer time horizons or commitment planning and spend relatively more time doing contingency or orientation planning. Planning in time means having a realistic appreciation for time-distance factors. It means understanding how long it takes to initiate certain actions and not trying to plan actions that are already outside of our window of opportunity. Planning is shaping. The discussion of planning in time leads us to related concept, planning as shaping. The idea of conceiving the taking actions now with an eye toward future advantage. Planning is a primary means by which we give advantageous shape to the course of events over time. Shaping the course of events means exploiting and cultivating opportunities that arise naturally, as well as actively creating and developing advantages. Ideally, when the decisive moment arrives, the issue has already been resolved. our actions leading to this point have so shaped the conditions that the result is a matter of course. We have shaped the action decisively to our advantage. In this respect, a commander tries not so much to precisely direct the actions of subordinates, but instead to provide subordinates with every possible advantage over the opponent. We should try to shape events in a way that allows us several alternatives and avoids irreversible commitments. And this means to be decisively engaged, right? The object of planning in this regard is to provide the maximum degree of freedom for future action. In this way, we make it more difficult for the enemy to anticipate and counter us. We want to ensure that when the moment of encounter arrives, we have not narrowed ourselves to only one course of action. Examples of shaping include planning a deception to influence enemies' expectations, canalizing, delaying, or blocking the movement of enemy forces, devising a program to strip the enemy of a particular critical capability, and drawing an enemy force into unfavorable terrain. Effective shaping requires an appreciation for appropriate time horizons, whether those horizons are measured in the days and weeks of senior commanders or the minutes, hours, and days of tactical commanders. Planning horizons are situation dependent, although generally the higher the echelon, the longer the horizon. And the longer the horizon, the less specific we can be in our plans. Usually, we must be able to plan with several different horizons simultaneously and to plan in different modes for each. We can think in terms of a commitment horizon within which we are confident enough of our ability to forecast events that we can commit to a particular plan. Beyond that horizon, we can think of a contingency horizon, within which we plan for several different contingencies without committing to any one. Beyond the contingency horizon, we realize the situation is too uncertain to plan for specific contingencies, and we instead perform orientation planning that allows us to respond quickly and flexibly to broad variety of circumstances, and therefore see figure 6 on page 3 TAC 20. So this figure, I'm going to, again, Legionary, I keep on telling you, buy this book, buy the publication, read all the pubs, make sure you have it, make sure that you're constantly going through it and committing it to memory, not by rote, but by conceptualization. But returning to the figure, what does the figure look like, okay? So what I see on the piece of paper are 3 arrows, and oriented, basically if you have a rectangle that's like a page, at the bottom of the page is commitment planning, okay? That's a bold arrow. And then right above that commitment planning is a semicircle, which is the limit. This limit is called the commitment horizon, okay? And then over the commitment horizon is this contingency planning. And over the contingency planning arrow is the contingency horizon. And then over that, of course, is the orientation planning. And over that is just a word, future. As you basically progress up the page as opposed to down the page. So imagine if you're reading a book and you go down the page, you're going up this time. There's a big arrow that says uncertainty increasing. So obviously, as the page previously had described, as you progress up this diagram, the more uncertain situations become. So commitment planning is more certain than contingency planning, and contingency planning is more certain than the overall future that may result, okay? The best way to think about this is I know what I'm going to do today, right? At my shop, let's say, right? You're an MOS, you're a shop, and you're doing your thing. You know, in general, what it is that you want to do to achieve that higher promotion. Let's say you want to pick up a rank or whatever. That's contingency planning, and you understand whether or not you should go to this school, this follow-on school, this follow-on education. And then beyond that, of course, is the future. Whether or not you're going to make those, 20 years to retirement, or if you're going to make it to E9 or O9 or whatever it may be. It's absolutely essential that you understand these horizons interdict over time. What is most proximate to you is what's most within your grasp to plan for and commit to. What is most distant from you is obviously what is most uncertain, and therefore not able to react in a way that you're usually used to on a day-to-day basis. Returning to the text. To use planning to shape the action does not mean to establish detailed timetable of events far into the future. We have already concluded that in war, we cannot expect to shape the conditions of war with any sort of precision. Rather, we attempt to shape the general conditions of war. We try to achieve a certain measure of ordered disorder. The further ahead we think, the more general must be our designs. As events approach, we can try to influence them more positively, but we should realize that we can rarely orchestrate them with any meaningful degree of precision. Shaping events over time requires both forward and reverse planning, thinking forward to the next feasible step, and the next after that, while also thinking backward from the desired future. However, we must keep in mind that the envisaged end state is an aiming point for planning purposes and not necessarily a permanent goal, right? So this is a placeholder, not necessarily, the goal per se. You have to be okay with shifting that so that way you're able to orient yourself. This is just simply an orientation dot, okay? Continuous evolutionary planning. Planning is a continuous process involving the ongoing adjustment of means and ends. We should also view planning as an evolutionary process involving continuous adjustment and improvement. We can think of planning as solution by evolution rather than solution by engineering. We should generally not view planning as trying to solve a problem in one iteration because most military problems are too complex to be solved that way. In many cases, it is more advisable to find a workable solution quickly and improve the solution as time permits. What matters most is not generating the best possible plan, but achieving the best possible result. In many cases, a reasonable course of action executed quickly and aggressively is better than an optimal course executed too late. We should generally view planning as an evolving continuously and iteratively towards the best executable solution that circumstances allow until the process is interrupted by the imperative to act. Effective planning continuously refines and deepens the plan as time permits. Likewise, we should see each plan as an evolving rather than a static document. Like planning, plans should be dynamic. A static plan is of no value to an adaptive organization in a fluid situation. Because militaries are hierarchical organizations, planning is generally seen as proceeding sequentially from the top of the organization toward the bottom. This is true to some extent as orders from above provide the basis for planning at each level. However, an organization characterized by continuous planning must plan in parallel, all echelons planning at the same time. Continuous planning requires continuous coordination laterally and between echelons as plans are adjusted and refined over time. Now, Legionnaires, I'm not going to waste your time. There's a section called Participatory Planning. It is good. All it's basically is saying is that you should not simply be planning in isolation. You should be cooperating and corroborating evidence together so that way you can come with the best plan forward. So that means delegating, of course, the OODA loop cycle, letting your subordinates and obviously the possibility of your superior proffer any ideas or comments, and then incorporating in the final synthesis. Then, of course, there's a last section here called Commanders and Planners, and effectively what it does is it explains to the individual that the planning and commandership are one and the same utility. Ultimately, what a unit is at the very base is the synthesis of a many with the mind of one, which is to say, to become one with multi-bodies, if that makes sense, okay? I know that sounds kind of strange, but again, this is why I recommend that you buy this publishing, this doctrine, and you read it yourself, so that way you're able to imbibe the information in here within these solutions. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the last section here, and then conclusion, and we'll conclude from there. Plans and orders.
Commanders issue orders and plans to subordinates to give effect to their decisions. Except in extreme cases, all directives to a unit should be issued to the commander of that unit. Likewise, orders and instructions to a unit should emanate from its immediate superior. By these means, authority and responsibility are fixed, and the channels of command are established. We should bypass echelons of command only by exception, and in such cases, both the issuing and receiving commanders should notify intermediates of their new instructions as soon as possible. Directives should not trespass on the province of subordinates. Directives should convey the minimum amount of instruction necessary for effective execution. Instructions that repeat matters of training or standard procedure weaken a directive, which should generally contain only information particular to the action being ordered. So what they're saying is effectively a frago, right? So you don't need to be saying the things that are already known. Otherwise, it's overkill sometimes, okay? Except when it's incredibly salient, which is then obviously an exception, but generally speaking, the default should be not to overstate the obvious. Reading again. While planning can be a valuable learning process for planners, plans and orders exist for those who receive and execute them rather than those who write them. Directives must be written with an appreciation for the practical problems of execution. They must facilitate rather than complicate action. They should not be so complex that they become an impediment to comprehension. For example, orders generally should not include instructions for more than a few likely contingencies. Above all, directives must be adapted to the circumstances under which they will be received and executed. So just a comment here, I read somewhere B.H. Littlehart explained that basically there's going to be a main effort, mission, and plan. A contingency should be 1 or 2, and then the third or the last contingency should be basically a writ large order, which is a commander's intent. Should be basically effectively, in the absence of orders, kill anything that moves, right? So ultimately, you should understand that even though there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat, there are a few ways which make the most sense. In those ways, you should plan contingencies. Does that make sense? A great way to explain this is, for instance, when an enemy is reinforcing another enemy element adjacent to it, it usually follows the line of least resistance, right? So the axis of attack, or along a main supply route, which is a highway, a road, established asphalt. Of course, they could, put a whole bunch of ammunition, supplies, men on foot, and go through a really circuitous and out of the way, but that's very unlikely. It's more likely that they will pursue it by the path which most understand would usually attribute any kind of resupply mission, and therefore when you write a contingency you should bear that in mind. Now going back, directives should be as clear as possible and concise as the situation permits. Elaborateness and extreme detail are not generally characteristics of effective plans and orders. The more urgent the situation, the greater the need for brevity and simplicity. Where possible, the greater the need of brevity and simplicity. Where possible, we should use oral orders that are communicated directly between principals. Short sentences are easily understood. Superfluous, trite, or trivial phrases weaken an order and create ambiguity. To aid understanding, we should make widespread use of map overlays, graphics, and other visual techniques, as they tend to expedite understanding. Directives should contain a statement of the intent behind the ordered actions to ensure the intelligent cooperation and initiative of subordinates. This statement of intent should be brief, unambiguous, and compelling. It should be brief enough that a subordinate can keep it clearly in mind during the disorder and distress of action without having to refer to written instructions. Orders should instruct only so far as conditions can reasonably be foreseen. Orders which attempt to arrange details too far in advance usually have to be countermanded. Such changes tax the communication system, cause confusion and misunderstanding, impose needless hardships on personnel, and harm morale. Standard order formats expedite understanding, prevent omissions, and facilitate ready reference. However, content clarity and conciseness are more important than format. Slavishly following a prescribed format can result in rigid form and unimaginative content not consistent with the unique requirements of each situation. In general, orders should not merely repeat information and instructions from higher authority. Rather, orders at each echelon should adapt the scope of information and the level of detail to the particular situation and echelon of their unit. Conclusion. Our approach to planning recognizes and accepts the complex, uncertain, disorderly, and time-competitive nature of war and seeks to provide commanders with the best means to win under those circumstances. We recognize the limits of design under such conditions. We recognize that planning cannot impose order and control on the battlefield, and it should not try. At the same time, we recognize the importance of planning in preparing us to act in a purposeful and prepared way in this environment. We seek to achieve a balance between providing the necessary focus, direction, and coordination, and allowing the necessary latitude for initiative and adaptation. In this respect, we recognize that the commander is the single most important factor in effective planning. The commander disciplines the planning process so that it is sensitive to time, planning horizons, level of detail, and simplicity. Under the commander's direction and guidance, the process shifts among the various planning modes, types, and levels, seeking to harmonize the factors that define the planning environment. The commander also disciplines the product to ensure that the resulting plan is relevant to the moment and suitable to subordinates. End quote. Oh, rather, check that. We got a little bit more. Our objective is to plan in a way that maximizes tempo, flexibility, and adaptation to action. We recognize that few plans will ever be carried out the way that they're designed, and in fact, they're not meant to be. We realize that the measure of a good plan is not whether it is executed as intended, but whether it provides the basis for effective action. The ultimate measure of effective planning is the answer to the following question: can we act faster and more effectively than the enemy? And there it is. I think this is probably one of the best MCDPs out there as far as doctrine is concerned, but it's incumbent upon you to actually read it. This is simply a primer, my thoughts, and likely will permeate throughout my historical case studies that I'll be providing with you legionaries in the future. But it's essential that you're using this doctrine, just as it said before in MCDP 5, the first installment of this chapter, the first chapter, that doctrine doesn't necessarily provide a how-to manual. It provides a frame of thinking, okay? And so whenever you're analyzing the actions of historical case studies, it's not necessarily about doing right or wrong. It's about necessarily how well they performed under which conditions, how much stress they were able to persevere and seek victory from, while obviously utilizing a great plan, which should be a catalyst for action. That's the best way to think about a plan. It's a catalyst for action, right? A tool. It's almost like a sleuth, a razor through reality. It shouldn't be this how-to plan, waypoint by waypoint. That's way superficial, and it's sclerotic and will break apart just as soon as it hits contact. So anyway, Legionaries, that's just the end of the third session here. Me and Sergeant Barnes will retire now, and we're going to take up our position here and go on patrol for Charlie. Till next time, this is Technica with Sergeant Barnes, General Lance, signing off.